This evening, we're talking about Rebecca's new book, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. At the bottom of your window, you'll see a Q&A icon. You can click there and type a question. My colleagues Bree and Alex behind the scenes will be filtering them through to me to ask a little bit later. Rebecca, let me start with you. You've known about climate change for a long time, but it wasn't at the centre of your life until about 18 months ago. You say in your book that until then you'd registered it rationally, but not emotionally. Tell us about that emotional experience and why you think it provoked such a seismic shift in you.
Yeah, look, it was, there's probably been very few moments in my life where you feel a kind of emotional shift that changes everything. And I suppose people call it an epiphany. Critics of people who care about climate change would call it some kind of, religious fervor or something, some kind of, they probably think it's a derogatory thing that makes you a little bit of zealot. But I'd been researching climate change for a long time. I absolutely believed that it was happening. I thought that governments should do something about it. But it was really only until early one morning, and I start the book talking about this, is that I was watching the kids' climate strike. I think it was the second one. And, whether I perhaps hadn't drunk enough coffee or too much, or it was kind of, the dawn was happening, is that I looked at these kids who were only a little bit older than my eldest child and thinking, good on them. They're putting down their iPhones and trying to tell the powers that be to do something. And then for a moment I realised, I'm not one of those kids. I'm not even only 10 years older than them. I'm the parent, the generation. So, and to the extent that I have a platform and a responsibility to do something about this, I actually felt that they were talking to me quite directly. And it was, and it was an emotional and psychological worldview shift that felt physical at the time. And I thought, no, this is actually what I need to focus my professional and personal energy on. So it was really a moment. Now, I think I probably was drifting in that direction for a long time. If we think about something like the Yale Six Americas study, which we're about to launch in Australia, I was probably always in the kind of generally concerned group, but not alarmed. I didn't spend a lot of time worrying or fretting about climate change. My concern about the environment and climate change wasn't something that framed my decisions as a consumer. It informed my decisions as a voter, but it's not something that kept me up at night in any way. And then suddenly I kind of tipped from that generally concerned to quite alarmed, almost in a moment, and started to rethink a whole lot of my decisions and how the future would be, and certainly where I was going to direct my professional energies from this point on.
I've heard you say also that it was wildly inconvenient. It's a lot easier to hold this anxiety.
Right. It was wildly inconvenient because what it requires, and that was quite difficult, was really quite difficult conversations with people. So, I had a very difficult conversation with my ex-husband at the time when we were talking about whether we take our kids. We took our eldest kid to Disneyland when she was about 5. And we were talking about, he was saying, we should take our twins who are now 5 to Disneyland. And I said, well, you can do that, but I won't do that. I have to think about every decision that I make about getting onto a plane. I really have to think, do I really need to get onto this plane? And we had a similarly difficult conversation about whether our next car would be electric or not. And whether we, so it was a really difficult conversation to have with people close to you, that this was something that was going to significantly inform your personal choices. And then, of course, professionally, I made a decision to decide, and, it's been postponed a bit from COVID, but it's something that I want to do is a challenge to everybody in the social and market research industry to really think about whether they do any work for fossil fuel companies and whether they have, quite difficult conversations with their clients about whether they take climate change seriously, which for me means potentially turning down work as much as it is generating work. So those kinds of deeply ethical questions about, you know, there's only so many decisions you get to make or power that you have. You have power as a voter, which is pretty limited. You know, it kind of comes across every now, you know, en masse it's important, but individually. You have some power as a consumer, as somebody who has a superannuation account that you decide where you want to put that. But you also have power as a professional about where you decide to direct your labour. And when you decide that every part of every decision you make, no matter what your identity is going to be directed towards a signal through the system, whether that be, you know, the market, the labour market, the political system, that this matters and that this is something that you don't just say you're concerned about, but you say is a priority, then that's a really profound thing. And then, of course, part of it is in part of what's happened in the last couple of years as I've returned to being more involved in the Australian Labor Party. You know, I have a lot of respect for people in the Greens, but really there's a fight in the Australian Labor Party at the moment about the direction, about our climate policy and what we need to do in terms of, you know, gas and fossil fuels and renewables. And throwing myself into that arena as well has been a decision that's been a difficult one, but an important one. So it's brought about a change, a profound change in my life. I got a tattoo, which I never thought I would get, which is a kind of an S. So it's an initial of all my children have a name beginning with S, which is, I literally felt like I needed to put something into my skin that reminded me that this was something that was going to, you know, that everything I was doing was for a safer and more secure and livable future for them and all the other children of their generation. So I actually felt like I needed to do something, you know, embed something inside me to be able to continue to keep this as my central focus and compass in life. Is that wildly inconvenient? Yes, it is, because it's required like quite big changes. But, you know, compared to the changes that the people of some people in the Pacific Islands or the Pacific, you know, or the people in Bangladesh or any of those other people who are being affected by climate change today in profound ways, it's actually not a great punish. Yeah.
Lesley, let me jump to you. We're talking about that big moment in Rebecca's life. As a scientist, obviously, you've taken an intellectual and rational approach to climate change for a long time, but I know it's an emotional issue for you too. When did you start becoming emotional about climate change?
Well, unlike Rebecca, there's a couple of things unlike Rebecca. I don't yet have a tattoo. My kids.
It's not as painful as you think it's going to be. I encourage you to get one.
For me, it was a much slower burn. So I've been doing climate change research as an ecologist for 30 years. I've been a sort of a climate change communicator, I suppose, for 10 to 15 and active with the Climate Commission and the Climate Council for the last 6 or 7. So for me, there was no real light bulb moment. I don't think it was more of a slow burn and an increasing concern. I mean, I got into climate change research because I thought I'd have a better chance of getting a job in some sort of applied field. And as you know, Lisa, I've written that it's a bit like Hotel California. You know, once you're in climate change, you never get out of it. No one ever gets out of it because it does take over your life. And like Rebecca, you know, it becomes absolutely all important. But for me, it was a kind of a slower, started out as a rather mercenary decision, became very much an academic pursuit, an intellectual decision. And really, but over the last decade, I suppose it's been an absolute passion. But that's been a gradual thing.
Amanda, you've worked on climate change for a very long time. Did you need to have an emotional experience before you engaged deeply with the issue, or were you convinced and inspired to act based on the facts?
I think the facts spoke to me in an emotional way at the start. When I first learned about climate change, it was in the context of studying at university and working as a volunteer for refugees as a junior lawyer. And I think as I read about climate change, it just immediately struck me how what the human face of this would look like. And I could imagine the waves of refugees, the conflict that could come, and the devastating consequences. I think, though, I do remember an experience that really rocked me, though, and I'd been working on climate change since 2005. And then in 2007, when I was at the Bali climate talks, international climate talks, I met a number of women from the Pacific who were talking about what it meant for them to see the climate change. And a woman from Kiribati stood up and she spoke about, and Kiribati is only 2 meters above sea level, and she spoke about how that they were anticipating, already having seen a range of inundation across the islands, what it would be like to visit their ancestral graveyards on a boat above the ocean and trying to identify where they were so that they could continue their cultures, so that they could continue paying their respects to those that had come before them. And it really struck me, like, what does it take to maintain a culture that is so interlinked with the land if your land no longer exists? So that had a big impact on me at that time. And it was just at the time I was starting the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and trying to get a bit of a reality check on, as a wealthy Australian, a country that is so wealthy comparatively, what is our responsibility when you have a country like Kiribati who, is significantly impoverished, that plays such a marginal role in creating the problem, but is going to suffer so greatly. So that human impact has been with me right since the start, and it's been one of the big driving forces for me.
Thanks, Amanda. Rebecca, you have lots to say, obviously, about climate change in your professional life, but you say in the book you have trouble talking about it with people you love. And you say this is not unusual. The vast majority of us rarely or almost never talk about climate change, and women talk about it less than men. Why do we find it so hard?
So look, a lot of the research, and not just in Australia, overseas, shows that women find it harder to talk about it than men because they often think they know less about the science. Interestingly, they probably know as much about the science as men. They just don't have the confidence necessarily. They're probably a bit more modest about their scientific understanding. And, this is where gender plays a really important role. This kind of idea that you would be kind of, strident, outspoken, invite argument, invite conflict into the family by talking about climate change is something that some women would feel kind of quite anxious about. That being said, in the same way that the nuclear disarmament movement was very much led by women, we know, and particularly if we look at the climate strike, so many of the leaders are women. And I talk about in the book about some of the really interesting research that shows that teenage girls are extraordinarily effective climate communicators for a whole range of reasons. I think I find it hard talking about it with people I love because, when I go into my mum's house and, all the lights are blazing and she's got the dryer on for one article, one bit of clothing and, all the rest of it, me lecturing her about climate change and her responsibilities about climate change is not going to be a really good start to, the rare visits I take to her at the moment with COVID. So, introducing a divisive, difficult topic which raises a whole range of emotional responses in us, including guilt, shame, anger, and all the book is each chapter goes through that, into already complex relationships is very difficult. And so when I was thinking about the book, I was thinking about, a quite common experience that gets talked about in the research I do, which is when, you get the family together for Christmas or dinner and maybe climate change comes up and then suddenly everybody's, at each other and the mother is just like, well, everybody just shut up, stop drinking and, help me clear the table, So that kind of sense of which there can be intergenerational tension between it's become worse than sex and politics in terms of the thing that you raise. So it is incredibly difficult to talk about it in a way that doesn't make you sound like you're kind of wagging the finger. I find it particularly hard to talk about it with my kids because I do know, and a lot of psychologists and associations, psychiatric and mental health associations around the world have identified that young people who are already experiencing issues around anxiety do latch on to climate change as a very justifiable reason to be anxious. So I don't want to trigger an anxious response in my kids. I don't want to lie to them about climate change. I want them to take some of their concern and anxiety and direct that in a positive way. It's very hard to talk about it with my 5-year-old twins, so we tend to kind of fall back into discuss. I read them the Lorax kind of regularly, other kinds of environmental books, and I lecture them about how much plastic we have in the house. But it's a very difficult thing to talk to them about. With my 12-year-old, it's easier, and we're quite lucky in Australia, but I think we could even do better about the extent to which climate change is now mainstreamed in the curriculum. It's not something that they don't know about and they learn about at school. And so talking to them about what that means to them in their future, you want to take a very kind of careful approach. You don't want to scare them. You don't want to get them have a sense of that they don't have any agency. But in many ways, what I'm doing in my professional life is a way that when they do arrive at the climate change question with a whole lot of anxiety, I can say, I'm in this, I'm here, what can we do together? It's really about being able to look them in the eye and say, I'm doing whatever I can, and if you want to be part of this, let's see what we can do.
What about you, Lesley? I know you talk obviously to huge numbers of people about climate change. Do you have trouble talking about it in your personal life?
I think I do, but probably for a different reason to Rebecca, because it has been such a big part of my professional life for so long. If I go out to dinner with friends, then talking about climate change is frankly the very last thing I want to do. I want to relax.
Yeah, you're over it. Yeah,
sitting around a table, and Rebecca talks a bit about our mutual friend Anna Rose in the book. As such a wonderful advocate, and I'll never forget being in a taxi with Anna once up in Queensland. And when I'm in a taxi, I am silent. I don't want to engage with anybody. I just want to get to somewhere. Whereas Anna gets in this taxi, and the first thing she starts to talk about with the taxi driver is climate change and where we're going and what we're doing and who we're talking to. And it was just such a contrast with my attitude in taxi. So I think, we're all really, really different. And Anna's probably watching this right now. Yeah. And I asked her,
Anna.
She said, I never lose an opportunity to talk to people about climate change, which is totally admirable. But, when I'm out relaxing, having a meal, having a drink, I don't want to talk about climate change.
Amanda, what about you? Do you avoid talking about climate change with tricky relatives?
You're on mute, Amanda.
Sorry, I do have some tricky relatives at times, but I think the way I engage is I think you've got to balance your emotional energy and where you want to put it. So I think about where I want to put my emotional energy and where is most strategic. And I think there's no point in talking to my Uncle John about climate change. He's got a level of skepticism, but then he's not out there, he's not Andrew Bolt out there with a big audience trying to change people. He's a person in his community getting on with his thing. It's not a big deal. It's not up to me to change his mind. And that's my advice to people really, is you're better off working with people where there's a little bit of an open door. And then I think what Rebecca was reflecting on is that there's different reasons for feeling challenged to talk to loved ones. Like I think the skepticism thing usually comes up, but actually a very small percentage of people now are skeptics. It's more about like, how do we go about creating change? What is that process? I don't want to scare people. I don't want people to feel anxious, like Rebecca was saying. So I think the other alternative is to be thinking really about action. And I think Rebecca talked about that in a lovely way at the end about how, well, if you can talk about what the action is that you're taking or what's underway, that's the thing that's exciting. Talking about the challenge in of itself is important, but more important is to talk about the solutions, how you're involved and how people can get along with you. That's the bit that's compelling. And then you don't leave everyone in the emotional guilt, shame place. You're taking people on a much more positive journey.
I think we need to make a really big distinction between people who are professional deniers and people who are amateur deniers.
I'll actually come back to that, Rebecca. I want to get to the sort of active and passive deniers in a bit. Before that, You say it took you longer than it should have to realise that science isn't enough to convince people about climate change. And it's because essentially we're messy humans who don't always think rationally. Talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, no, and I think that it's so much to do with my training and with my personality. So I am somebody who I was trained as a lawyer. I did a PhD, you know, and my life is about data, right? It's about spreadsheets and statistics and all the rest of it. And so I'm quite rational, and I'm not a particularly emotional person, and I'm not particularly, you know, I don't believe in horoscopes or any of those other kind. Like I'm not a particularly spiritual person either. And so I think, interestingly, my training and also my personality led me to think, well, we just have to continue to present the facts to people, and people are going to, and if we just present the facts continuously, and if the right people talk about the facts, then it will all be fine. And so, and because also I didn't do a psychology degree at university, I did politics and I did law, I didn't have that training that actually, you know, humans are messy. They are a kind of complex combination of rational and irrational. And of course, you know, that's one of the reasons why the Thinking Fast and Slow book that, you know, everybody buys and not everybody reads is so kind of effective in terms of understanding how we process things and how different parts of our brain, how we process political messages and all kinds of messages. So I think I realised that the facts about climate change, which have now been, you know, at a very simple level, pretty well circulated now for 30 years, you know, and also what is extraordinary, as everybody would know, you know, the actual facts of climate change have not changed dramatically over that time. You know, the very kind of early sense of what was happening and the various projections. I mean, obviously there's, as Lesley would know, there's details, but you don't really have to have a really, really good understanding of science to understand the basic fact of climate change, the basic way it works. And so I realised that's just not enough. Yelling at people or showing them more statistics or showing them more graphs or doubling down on the science is not going to bring about the breakthrough that we need. And where we are at the moment, and we've flatlined, is that the majority of people believe the science, believe that we're making a contribution, want action, but then that does not translate to the kinds of things that we need to see happen in our political system, in our economy, in the way that people vote, in the way that they live their lives. And that is not about scientific fact, that is about feeling, emotion, social and cultural issues that we need to address.
Lesley, do you agree as the scientist here with what Rebecca is saying, which is essentially rational science communication can only get us so far?
Yes, I absolutely do. And it's been a hard lesson over the last 10 years or so. And I'll tell you a story that happened when Amanda and I were on the Climate Commission about 9 years ago. And we were travelling all over Australia. You know, this is before Tony Abbott sacked the Climate Commission, but we were travelling all over Australia, getting up in town, literally in town halls and RSL clubs and all sorts of places, and doing Q&A with the local populace. And before we started the Q&A, Will Stephan and I would get up and give a little science presentation about the local area and climate impacts and that sort of thing. And I had these graphs that scared the living daylights out of me, and I would put them up and you could just see 500 eyes just sort of glaze over with a few that would sort of perk up. And I remember being up in Mackay. It was George Christensen's seat. George was up the back. You know, pretty conservative electorate. And I thought, I've got to do something different. So about 5 minutes before we went on stage, I quickly altered this graph and I did some back of the envelope calculations. And on this graph, which basically shows temperatures going up to sort of 7 degrees by the end of the century, under a sort of unmitigated climate change, I put my lifespan on there at the you know, assuming I'll live till I'm 85, at the sort of place, the average temperature that I will experience. Then I put my kids' lifespan, and they're now in their early 20s. And then I put my hypothetical grandkids' lifespan, you know, assuming my kids have kids when they're about 30, and my grandkids will live, if I have them, will live into the next century. And it was, so I put it up there showing that my kids and their kids will experience potentially just extraordinary levels of climate change. Anyway, I didn't think much of it. I thought, oh, well, maybe that's connected with somebody. And then after the talk, we'd go down and have a cup of tea with the audience. And this woman came up to me and she said, when you put that slide up, I burst into tears. She said, because I've got grandkids, and that was the first time that climate change has ever seemed real to me. So after that, I've showed that graph a million times now, of course, and other people show it as well. And our climate councillor colleague Joelle has even put it in her book. So it was a salutary lesson about how, you know, more science, more understanding, more rationality doesn't actually get you over the hump of really making a lot of people care. And we have to look for other ways.
Amanda, Rebecca quotes a climate change communications expert from Yale University in her book, and he says the messenger is more important than the message. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's been a big focus for us over the last about 5 years. Well, a bit longer actually. We did this at the Climate Commission too, but really in earnest at the Climate Council, has been to say, well, let's connect with audiences and work out who are going to be the right spokespeople to carry our message into that audience. We're not always the right people to connect with them. And it was clear when we got into working on the Climate Commission that one of the big challenges that climate change predominantly was talked about by scientists, by policy wonks, and by sort of public commentators. And it's very hard to get it out of the just purely political discourse when it's so framed within that context. So we wanted to bring in a whole range of other voices. And initially at the Commission, we would bring people along to our press conference. We get a farmer to speak when we were talking about drought, for instance, or a firefighter around fires. But in the last 5 years at the Council, we've been really focused on a project called the Climate Media Centre, which is there to train spokespeople. So farmers, firefighters, doctors, other health professionals, solar installers, people who are at the front lines of the problem and the solution, and then help them to get into the media and tell the story. So that's not about the Climate Council being out in front. It's really about supporting other people to be out in front. And that outfit, the Climate Media Centre, generates about 6,000 media items a year now. It's focused in regional Australia, in particular in communities that we think need to hear those voices. And we've also support groups like the Farmers for Climate Action, for instance. It's been really effective in communicating to farmers through farmers, and then through farmers to their elected representatives. We also did a lot of work that many of the Climate Council supporters will have seen, but hopefully most people have seen, with emergency leaders for climate action. So Greg Mullins, a former fire commissioner from New South Wales, is one of our climate councillors. We worked with him to establish a network of former fire chiefs, there's now 30 of them, that put out a warning a bit earlier than this time last year, and then they got a huge amount of coverage over the summer. So the summer, it was critical to have those voices that are highly trusted, that can speak to a broader audience, particularly when it's in such a difficult political discourse.
Rebecca, you quote the climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe, who says communicating effectively with people about climate change often doesn't involve talking about the science. We need to find out about a person's values and their interests, and then connect the dots between the values they already have and why they would care about a changing climate. Can you give us an example of this?
Yeah, look, one of my favourite examples that I talk about in the book, in the chapter on love, is a really terrific piece of research and a kind of campaign that was done by this wonderful woman who was leading advocacy for the Audubon Society in the United States, which is, for people who don't know, it's a heritage environmental organisation, or a heritage conservation, 100 years old. It's about bird watching. If there's any bird watch, there are bound to be, with all of these people on the line, bird watchers. And I just say that you're great. I love bird watchers. I know it's a bit of a nerdy hobby, but birds are literally the canary in the coal mine often in relation to things like climate change. And what I really loved about this research, it showed that that one of the things that was really critical for these bird watchers getting them involved in any kind of traditional climate action is you really had to understand what their values were and what they often found difficult about the traditional climate change script. And one of the central insights from that research, and that comes out continuously in the work that Yale does, is that if believing about climate change means for you that you have to completely rethink your identity as a regional or rural, somebody who lives in regional or a rural area in a country, or as a conservative, it means that it's too big a price to pay for being concerned about climate. So one of the things they really worked out is that there were certain things about the traditional climate script that really ticked off these kinds of right, what I'd say left of right or conservative bird watchers. And so they found a way to kind of get them, they already cared about birds, they already cared about the habitat of birds, and to kind of almost sidestep some of those landmines to get them to really be focused on what some of the critical solutions would be. And it let them keep their identity as rural and regional voters and as conservatives, but still act on climate change. So that was really, really good example about, and of course, one of the other things they did, which was really important, is that in that campaign, they trained other bird watchers to do it. It wasn't the traditional kind of climate or environmental spokespeople. It was really people who lived in those areas, loved birds, had watched them for years, and were able to talk directly to other bird watchers. So it was a lovely little example, but I thought it was a really good model for how you can mobilise all kinds of groups of people. And as Amanda said, that's been done incredibly effectively in Australia with farmers. And I think I would like to see more and more professional organisations like mine. We're getting to see lots of them pop up, whether it be engineers, architects, there's veterinarians for climate science, obviously lots of medical professionals. Being able to talk from a professional and personal point of view about saying, in this job that you love and this identity you have as a professional, you have an investment in talking about climate, doing something about it. And I think those kinds of, they're kind of the diversity of stories and the diversity of getting into the climate issue through lots of different avenues, I think is going to be the key.
Thanks, Rebecca. Lesley, 2 years ago, you published an award-winning piece in The Monthly, and it's one of my favourite magazine pieces on communicating climate change. It's called When Planetary Catastrophe is Your Day Job. You give many talks and you write in the piece, I've got a little bit of it here. I work hard to be engaging, keeping the text and complex graphs to a minimum, adding lots of pictures and analogies, personal anecdotes, and even the odd joke. And therein lies the conundrum. As a scientist, I feel a compulsion to deliver the facts as we currently understand them, but too much doom and gloom is paralysing. Apocalypse fatigue can send people under the metaphorical doona. How to balance motivation and despair. Lesley, it's a tightrope, isn't it?
It is a tightrope, and where you put that tightrope, of course, is also different for different audiences. So we really always have to balance being honest and not sugarcoating things, because in the long run that doesn't do anybody any favours. But if we're completely focused on doom, and it's very easy to do that, frankly, I've been described by more than one person as a Cassandra, which if people know their Greek mythology will know what I mean. But we also have to sort of give people hope, and hope is a big part of Rebecca's book, and I was really interested in what she said in that chapter. But it's a balance and it's a tightrope, and we're always falling off that tightrope in different audiences. And the key, I suppose, is to try to understand where to draw that line and to merge those two things so that you scare people a bit, because we do have to scare people, but also give them motivation and inspiration to actually do something. Because if people are just really informed and sitting on their couches at home, you could have 25 million Australians being concerned about climate change, but really what we need is for them to get off the couch and do something. So picking that balance is what we work on, and we talk about at the Climate Council all the time.
And at the Climate Council, Amanda, I think it's fair to say we're all deeply alarmed about climate change. And sometimes we want to scream, this is an emergency. But we actually know for a large number of people, it just doesn't work. They'll be annoyed, they'll be bored, they'll switch off. It's a really tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of meeting audiences where they're at. That doesn't mean you don't challenge an audience, but it means you're thinking about where someone is, where they are in their shoes, and what is going to be persuasive for them. What stories are relevant to them? What are the issues that are affecting them? And I remember we launched a report, a state renewable report, I think it was last year, and we were really keen to get it up in central Queensland. And, you know, there's been a lot of commentary around central Queensland being, you know, the coal-loving hub of Australia. My experience, having spoken to many people, done lots of presentations and things like that in those areas, is people don't necessarily love coal. They love jobs. They understand the insecurities that the coal industry can bring. They understand the issues around automation and other things. And they understand the environmental and health impacts around mining in general. But they want jobs, and it's not clear what the alternatives are. This report that we launched it had a section about how mining is going to be part of the renewable energy revolution. It has to be, because we've got to produce a whole lot of products, batteries, solar panels, etc., with minerals. And we released the report in Mount Isa with, in addition to doing it elsewhere, with the headline that this would create lots of new mining jobs in Mount Isa. And the front page of the local paper ran Mount Isa to lead green revolution. And I had 15 minutes on the local ABC talking to them about the opportunities in mining for their town. And it's just that thing of reorientating, saying, well, what's going to be interesting for people in this area? And there's some interesting research that says that if you tell people what the solution is before you tell them what the problem is, they're much more likely to accept that there was a problem in the first place. And I think that's a good illustration.
It's a really, really good
of where that works. You have to be able to present an alternative if you're going to tell someone that what they're doing is wrong. So that's, one of the important aspects.
Rebecca, you look at lots of different emotions in the book: guilt, fear, anger, despair, loss, denial, hope, love, and how they can all be utilised to galvanise action. Which one is the most effective, do you think, and why?
Look, I mean, and I never would have thought this going into it. I mean, obviously love can be an extraordinarily powerful emotion. But the chapter I loved the most, and interestingly, the chapter that my publisher liked the least, but the one that was most interesting to me was this notion of loss. And it goes back to what Lesley was saying. We can't kind of pretend, oh, look, we'll all just use keeper cups and put some solar panels on, it'll all be fine. Yes, climate change is happening, but nobody wants to be Pollyanna-ish, and nobody wants, there's this lovely term called toxic optimism. And we don't want toxic optimism. We don't want to give people false hope that just mere technology will get us out of this problem. And in fact, interestingly, that isn't the consensus across countries. People realise there has to be both behaviour change and technological advancement and government intervention and a whole of society approach to this. But I think the thing that I really liked about the notion of loss is that we're already losing, and the thought of losing more in the future is galvanising to us. It's not the same as despair, and it's certainly not the same as shame, but the notion of that we need to retain the things that, like, the notion that we will lose makes us really reflect on the things that we value. What is it that matters to us? What is it that matters to us as a community, as a nation? What do we want to hold on to? So contemplating loss can be extraordinarily mobilizing. And I think the other thing I found really interesting about loss is that we have to recognize that for people to come to the climate change table, and whether that be they believe in climate change or they believe in the solutions, I don't really care. I mostly want to get people behind the solutions. If they don't absolutely absorb the science, and that's not the best way to get them to be focused on the solution, that doesn't bother me. But if part of convincing people about the solution and the action that needs to be taken means that we strip away from them the things that really matter to them, whether that be their identity as a conservative or their religious belief or whatever, then that's not going to work. So we really have to understand how much are people prepared to give up and how much do we need to change. So the chapter on loss for me was the one that was the most useful and the most interesting. And I think about how we can talk to people about what we've lost, what we could lose, as a really galvanizing conversation to get them to do things. Because more broadly in our community, when you say to people, what are the things that worry you? They do think that we're losing things, whether that be civility between people or a sense of identity or a sense of community or loving our neighbours or a sense of independence or autonomy, or we're losing jobs, or it can be anything. Like that notion that things are being stripped away and that we don't have the ability to repair the things that matter to us, that can be incredibly powerful to people, and I think a very, very useful emotional and linguistic vein to mine when we talk about climate change to people.
And Lesley, how do you think we can make climate action irresistible?
Well, one of the things hopefully we need to do is make it easy. You know, there's not many people out there that will do things when they're too hard. And the example I would use is that, you know, a few years ago, I read that Cory Bernardi, when he was at the height of his conservative influence, had put solar panels on his roof. I don't actually know if it was true, but let's just go along with that. And I really reflected that, you know, I've got solar panels on my roof, and if Cory Bernardi and I have the same number of solar panels on our roofs, then our impact on the atmosphere is exactly the same via that action, regardless of our motivation in what we've done. So it really made me think about keeping our eye on the prize, which is actually the atmosphere. You know, the atmosphere doesn't care what we think. The atmosphere is affected by what we do. And we really have to keep reminding ourselves about that, because persuading people and getting people to agree with you is only part of the problem. It's actually getting people to do stuff that counts. And sometimes if people do the right thing, but perhaps for different reasons, you know, saving money on your electricity bill, well, that's just as good. So I think we do actually have to be hard-nosed about the end game here. What really matters is every single of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, and whatever we can do to stop that has got to be a good thing, and we need to approach that in multitudinous ways.
And Amanda, what do you think is the best way to galvanise people to act?
I think that there's a few things. I think people need something to do that's clear and feels possible to them. I think in general, people need a cohort to do it with, so they feel part of something. And then they need to feel a degree of pride in whatever that action is, that it's meaningful. And I wanted to give an example of this. One project that we have is the Cities Power Partnership, which is a project for local governments to get involved. And the idea is that there is something to do. Local governments can have pledges to reduce emissions, but there is a whole knowledge hub within that. So you don't just have to say, oh, I'm going to do a bulk buy of solar panels for my community. You can go on the knowledge hub and see examples of how it's been done already. And there's a whole plethora of ideas for you to come up with as the council sustainability officer. You don't have to just come up with it yourself. Then it's about the cohort. So it's about creating partnerships between councils. It's very easy to feel alone when you're trying to create change. And the more that you can feel part of a group, even if it's something that doesn't necessarily meet all the time, but you've got partners that might not be within your organisation, maybe outside it, that you can work to around providing a cohort. And that was really important when we started the Australian Youth Coalition, Youth Climate Coalition. It was, I think for young people in particular, that sort of social glue was really important in getting people active. But I think it's true of any demographic. And then the final bit is the celebration piece with the local governments. There was a big emphasis on, as soon as you join the partnership, we get a front page of you as local mayor on the front page of the paper celebrating what you're doing. You do any sort of activity, let's celebrate it. That's awesome. And it's about creating a degree of accountability, because now everyone's aware that the local mayor has said these things. They then have to do it. But it's also about making people feel good about it, because often people can feel like they're alone, as I said, or that they're pushing shit uphill on this stuff. I hope my mum's not watching. I'll get in trouble for saying that. Yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. Look, I have lots more I'd like to ask, but we're running a little bit over time, so I'll just jump to a few of our audience questions. And Rebecca, I said I'd get to you about active and passive denial.
Yeah.
I have a question from Darren. He says, hi, Rebecca, what do you think about investing time in trying to argue with deniers? On the one hand, it seems like a waste of time. On the other, I feel that if we don't engage, then people who are undecided will only see their message and may be converted. I learned a lot about the science through the reading I had to do to rebut their arguments. Now I feel quite well prepared to engage with anybody in person because I'm familiar with their arguments. What do you think?
Yeah, so there's a terrific chapter on denial, I think, because made more terrific by Anna Rose's experience doing the documentary, kind of going head to head with Nick Minchin. It was a really kind of classic conundrum about what happens when you engage with deniers. And I asked her at the end, whether she thought that was a process worth being part of. And I think she knew that by the end, that no matter what she did and no matter what anybody else did, they were never, ever going to convince him, because his ideological commitment to not believing in climate change was so strong. But she said it was important to do it because there was an audience. And there was an audience to be convinced. He wasn't to be convinced, but the audience was to be convinced. And in the work on denial, there's a very, very important distinction to be made between people who are amateurs and professionals. I absolutely believe that we need to do everything we can to make sure that hardcore climate change deniers are not in our parliaments and do not have significant influence in our media, because what they do is they amplify the view in the community that is actually a legitimate view to have. It is incredibly damaging. But I would say, if you have somebody, if you love a climate change denier, if they're an uncle or a grandparent, I think you really need to think about how much you go at them about their views. I've got to say that, I'm sad to say that all my grandparents are dead, but if they were alive, I don't think I'd spend my time arguing with them about climate change. I just spend my time being with them, because I don't think there's any payoff yelling at people that you love about their views unless they're really open to having a conversation with them about it. So I think we do have to make a distinction between the deniers that are professional, make their money from it, and make other people think that is a fact-based and legitimate way to think about the world. We're talking about hardcore deniers, not people who are undecided or dismissive or concerned. People who make incredible amounts of money doing this and get incredible amounts of power and status from it. You need to make a distinction between them and the people that you love, and maybe just don't yell at them at Christmas. Maybe just talk to them about Netflix. That might be a better way. In terms of everybody's got limited emotional time to spend to this issue, I think it can be better spent elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that goes to
do not yell at Uncle Pete.
I think that goes exactly to the point Amanda was making earlier about where to put your energy. Amanda, there's a question from Helen that I'll read to you. When COVID-19 was starting to look very serious just prior to lockdown here, I noticed that many of my friends simply could not believe it was happening. It seemed that many people absolutely could not accept that that reality would ever be anything different from the status quo that we have always known, even for quite well-educated, well-informed people. How do we deal with that lack of imagination, which to me seems a huge roadblock to a broader public understanding that our lives are directly threatened by climate change? Amanda?
It's a great question. And I think in the Australian context in particular, we have not witnessed very large scale shocks before. So I think it has been hard to explain that climate change could have such a devastating effect. I think people are most open to hearing that things will be better than they are now. They're most open to being optimistic, and they're most open to, it's hard to imagine things being different to what they are before. But I think that the bushfires this year have genuinely shocked us as a community. I think the smoke shocked us, and I think COVID has shocked us, that Australia is not immune to huge global challenges, that it can happen here. One of the interesting pieces of psychology is around change and when you can introduce change to someone. And one of the insights at a personal level is when you there is some level of change in your life, it's a good time to introduce another change. So if you move house, that's time to change your exercise regime. And I've been thinking about that in respect to COVID, that's been a large scale change. And so we're open to a whole range of other changes, and we just accepted them pretty rapidly. But will that translate in terms of the economic recovery to other types of change is the question. And one piece that we're doing a lot of work on at the moment is how to frame economic recovery in a way that will resonate with people. And you don't want to overwhelm people. I think that people's emotional bandwidth is really stretched at the moment. And introducing, the depressing story of climate change is a bit much. It was almost impossible to get stories up on the bleaching this year of the Great Barrier Reef, for instance. No one wanted to hear about it, not even journalists. So in the economic recovery story, one of the key frames we're looking at is about talking about the future, because everyone wants jobs, everyone agrees, we've got to have more jobs, we've got to make the economy thrive again. But we can do so in a way that also sets us up for the future, to tackle future economic shocks, to protect our community as we experience climate change. So if we can have jobs that also tackle climate change, that would be a really sensible place to put our economic stimulus spending. So we can't just invest, we shouldn't just invest in anything. The government's going to invest in things that also tackle these long-term challenges. So we're making the case for that at the moment, and we'll be putting out some the hard data. And it is, as Rebecca said, the facts are important but not sufficient, and then you've got to have the arguments on top of it that make it relevant. But you do have to have that evidence base first. So that's what we've been building up.
Thank you. Rebecca, there's a question from Dominic. You write in your book that the unique problem with climate change is that people don't react until the threat is tangible. But is there any way around this? People will act when they're directly affected, but if we wait until we see the changes and the damage to the environment, it's too late to act.
I think one of the things I'm thinking about is how do we make the threat tangible in conjunction with the opportunity tangible? So at the moment, most of my research is trying to get people to understand, well, what is the opportunity in terms of climate solutions, regardless of what you think about climate change, for the Australian economy, for manufacturing, for jobs, for energy security, for a cleaner environment, air, water, all the rest of it. So I think just saying to people, there is a threat and you will lose, and making that tangible is not enough. What you've got to do is get a sense of what is the opportunity right now that we don't want to lose, that will make our lives better and retain some of the things that we love about this country. So doing the two things together, I think, is really critical. Asking people to act now for something that they may or may not think is going to happen in 10, 20, 30 years' time. I've done enough research on Australians to know that when I ask them about the future, most of them, particularly the stressed ones, say, I'm just trying to get through the week. Don't ask me about how I'm even going to get through the end of the year. I think this is one of the reasons why the more children you have, the less likely you are to vote to say that climate change is something you worry about. I mean, children were a really important mobilizing issue for me, my kids. But in fact, if you have the more children you have, the less likely you are to vote for a political party with green policies. We showed that in some research we did for WWF in Australia, and that's actually been proven in other countries as well. I think you're just trying to get through the day, trying to get everybody to wear underpants. You really just don't want you really just don't want to think about climate change. So I think that is what we do. We make the threat and the possibility of loss tangible, but more importantly, we talk about the benefit right now of acting on climate change and the opportunity that we have. And we have that opportunity more today than we've ever had before in this country on that question. And that's where we require creative visualization, where we require really innovative leadership, where we require all different kinds of messengers to say, this is the way we need to go.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's almost time to wrap up. Yeah. I'm aware that there are a lot of people who've joined us tonight who aren't overly familiar with the Climate Council. Amanda, would you like to speak just very, very briefly a bit more about what we're focused on?
Yeah, sure. So the Climate Council exists for a number of reasons. The first is to provide that evidence-based and information-based climate change data, information, scientific reports to the Australian public. I think it's really important in democracy that there is a trusted source of information that anyone can go to access to understand the problem, the nature of the solutions, all of those sorts of things. The second piece is that we're a communications organisation primarily. We're here to change the public discourse. And we've spoken quite a lot about persuading people on an individual basis. The work that we do is really about persuading people at a community level. We talk about changing the public narrative on climate change. So it's a way to think about it is, what is the common sense proposition when a community is describing climate change? What are the things that a journalist would just write in their article as if everyone accepts? And so over time, we've been trying to move the dial on climate change, to move what is that common sense understanding about climate change. And that provides the framework in which politicians, business leaders, community leaders can operate in terms of what is generally accepted. And we do that in lots of different ways, through our reports, but also through, I mentioned earlier, working with a lot of trusted voices. And then the third thing we do is work on programs, which is dedicated to really changing certain constituencies or communities. So I mentioned the Cities Power Partnership earlier, which is a partnership of 125 local governments that's designed to get down emissions in those localities, which represents about 50% of the Australian population.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Congratulations on a terrific book, Rebecca.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Rebecca, Amanda, and Lesley for your time tonight. Also, thank you very much to our community of generous regular givers. The Climate Council is an independent, community-funded organisation, and we wouldn't be able to do this without you. All the best to everyone who's watching, and particularly those in Melbourne and the Mitchell Shire of Victoria who are returning to lockdown. Have a good evening.